What comes to mind when you hear the term public safety? Is it thriving neighborhoods, safe communities? Or are you like many people who hear the term public safety and automatically think police cars and officers in neighborhoods? We're on freeways, highways, pulling over speeding drivers, apprehending criminals, and keeping people safe? What if we reimagined public safety through the lens of the social determinants of health, as opposed to enforcement first policies? What if we thought of public safety in terms of public health rather than crime? Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Leisa Moseley Sales, the Director of State and Local Advocacy for the Fines and Fees Justice Center, also known as FFJC. I am honored to serve as your moderator for this most important discussion. We at FFJC are excited to host this first webinar in a series examining the current and widely accepted model of public safety as an enforcement and considering what a more holistic model and its impacts could look like. What is public safety, you might ask? Well, quoting from a report from New York University, fundamentally, safety is a core human need that comprises not only physical safety, but also security and health, housing, education, and living wage jobs. And just as it is preferable to prevent disease than treat it, so too must we prioritize preventing unsafety rather than just responding to it. A little over 10 years ago, in the wake of the Michael Brown shooting by a member of the Ferguson Police Department, the Department of Justice investigation uncovered a pattern of racially discriminatory practices, including assessing excessive fines and fees on individuals in the court system. We all learned that this practice was primarily rooted in the city's dependence on the criminal justice system to raise revenue. It is this report that is widely recognized and credited as a catalyst for the movement to reform fines and fees. A couple of points to illustrate how wealth extraction from fines and fees impacts public health. I want to share a few evidence-based facts with you. 42% of adults with court-related debt report unmet healthcare needs because of that debt, and in communities most reliant on fines and fees. Second point, jurisdictions that rely heavily on policing and ticketing to generate revenue are associated with higher overdose death rates, raising serious questions about whether enforcement-centered public safety models are protecting our community health or actively undermining it. Courts across the country use law enforcement as collection agents to collect revenue from fines and fees imposed on individuals in the criminal legal system. Research shows that this practice further exacerbates the destabilization of communities, contributing to declines in public safety outcomes. A couple of additional points from our report imposing stability to further illustrate the fact that fines and fees are more about revenue generation than safety. Between 2018 and 2022, the number of court cases dropped by 20%. Yet, the amount of fines and fees imposed increased by 3%. 13 states issued over 2.5 million benchmarks, subjecting each of those individuals to arrest and incarceration for failing to pay court debt or appear in court during the same 5-year period. Joining in today's discussion, we will explore how the extraction of wealth and resources from communities through fines and fees, and how enforcement-centered models of public safety impact community health. Please keep in mind that this webinar is not intended to have all of the answers. Rather, it is intended to provoke questions and spark dialogue. Joining me for today's discussion are Eve Hanan. Eve is a practicing defense attorney and professor of law at Boyd Law School. She's also the director of the Misdemeanor Clinic at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Andrew, or Andy Walsh, Andy as we like to call him, originally from Staten Island, New York, where he began his career, is now the undersheriff serving Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Alexius Marcano currently serves as Director of Director of Research and Policy at Coalition for the Homeless. And rounding out our panelists today, Matt Alsdorf, Associate Director for the Center for Effective Policy and the Co-Director of Advancing Pretrial Initiatives. So Sheriff Walsh, I want to start with you. How is public safety commonly defined within law enforcement? And how do you think that definition aligns or conflicts with how communities experience law enforcement and public safety? And what do you see as law enforcement's role in exploring alternative models of public safety?
Good morning, Lisa. And first of all, thank you for having us and the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department continually engaged with what you're doing here locally. It's an interesting conversation because public safety is something that I think you described a lot of what traditional mindsets have when it comes to what does it actually mean. And the enforcement-driven model, I think, is what, law enforcement is actually the title of the profession. So obviously, it's from internally, it's a very enforcement-driven what we do. But I think over the years and with the evolution of a lot of the research and some of the things that you spoke about, it's how do we use the laws and enforce the laws in a way that's commensurate with what the community expectations are for the police department. At the same time, keeping people safe, keeping people healthy, keeping neighborhoods, safe for people to go outside, making sure that how we enforce the laws are in line with the values of the community and not, just driven by, say, the heads or the, leaders within a law enforcement organization. It has to be commensurate with the values, but safety, health, all those things go together. People need to feel free in their own communities to be able to walk around and, go outside with their families and their kids and walk their dogs with a sense of safety, but at the same time, knowing that if there are things that need to be addressed by the use of the laws, that they have a police department that's going to be able to partner with them in order to keep them healthy and happy.
Sheriff Walsh, just to follow up, you've mentioned that community voices must be part of the discussion about policies that impact public safety. Can you expound on that just a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think a lot of times, especially folks in my position, I mean, after over 3 decades of doing this, I have a lens that I'm not embarrassed or ashamed or, running from. I know how I see the world. And, I think it always takes the evolution of groups and community leaders to offer me and other police leaders just a different lens for consideration when we're making policy decisions on what we're attempting, what we believe is the best path to public safety. It just can't simply be driven by the doom and gloom that I've seen and experienced, and people are similarly situated to me in other large police organizations in large cities. We have a particular lens in which we see it. So without input from the community, without having the wherewithal to listen to what people are saying, and sometimes we come up with policies that have a great impact and a positive effect on the community, but there's also the other side of that as well. Without input on policies, procedures, enforcement efforts, et cetera, then it's just going to be singularly driven back to that enforcement model. We need to always have a clear understanding and good partnerships to tell us what the impact of our thoughts could have or what our actions and our policies are having.
Thank you for that. Eve, I'd like to move to you. You've mentioned that individuals you serve in your misdemeanor clinic are not always facing jail time, but they're facing harmful fines and fees. Share with us what you have observed where misdemeanor fines and fees actually undermine public safety and public health and the impacts it has had on your clients and their families.
Thank you, Lisa, and I appreciate being part of this panel. As Lisa said, I'm a law professor at UNLV. I teach criminal law and procedure, but I'm also a clinical professor, and what that means is I supervise students in court. My most recent clinic is the misdemeanor clinic, where students represent people charged with misdemeanors. People can go to jail on misdemeanors. They can certainly get arrested and spend time pretrial on misdemeanors as well. But fines and fees are really I would say it's the bread and butter of what happens in the lower courts, municipal courts and justice courts. And often, I'm a former public defender. I was a public defender in Boston and DC. Often we as criminal defense attorneys ignored fines and fees. Our principal aim was keeping our clients out of prison, getting them out of pretrial detention, getting them back home to their families. Our professional obligation, and I also felt my ethical obligation, was their safety and the safety of the people who relied on them. Uh, Fines and fees were just an afterthought. Well, you'll figure out how to pay that later, or alternatively, you will just tell the court that you can't pay, and they'll work out something else for you, like community service. Goodbye and good luck to you. Right? That was how we handled it. So when I started doing the misdemeanor clinic with students, these cases are a good experience for them, but they were also amazing cases for me, and they continue to be as I look at these cases to see the devastating effects of the fines and fees on the health and well-being of our clients and their families. And I think what I'd like to do is just tell a story about a case that two of my students represented this gentleman on. He was in his early 60s. He was on disability. He had severe kidney and liver disease. And he was helping his family. His daughter had his granddaughter was in elementary school, and his daughter would drop the granddaughter off when she had to work nights and weekends. He would pick his granddaughter up from school. His apartment was full of toys for his granddaughter, and that was one of his principal activities, other than getting his medical care, dialysis, and other interventions that he needed to live. He had an older car, and with some frequency, he would get into a situation where he was late on an insurance payment on it, or he was unable to get his car registered in time. This only needed to happen a couple times before he was in the hole with the court for the fines and fees associated with that, and with the Department of Motor Vehicles for license reinstatement fees and so forth. All that put him in a position where warrants issued. When he'd go to court to clear the warrants, that would be a warrant clearing fee. If he signed up for a payment plan, there would be a monthly fee for the payment plan. When he asked the court for assistance or some way to manage all of this debt, which was ballooning into the thousands of dollars, he was told, well, you can always do community service. At the time I think it was $10 an hour. This is a case from about 5 years ago, but whether $12 or $13 an hour, the community service would require many hours, and most of his time was spoken for between childcare and his medical issues. So where did that leave us? My students made this impassioned argument. They provided all of the documents to the court, documenting his medical issues and documenting the childcare and everything else. And the result was that the judge said to them, there's a statute that says I can reduce the fines and fees. However, and the judge looked out at all the people waiting for their case to be called, if I do this for your client, everyone is going to ask me to do this. So I'm afraid I can't waive any of these fines and fees, but he can pay it at an amount of $50 a month plus, the new fees that we're attaching. The judge had the discretion to do something different, but not the obligation to do something different. And so my first point to make is just, we see this as a policing issue, but I went back to the Ferguson report to review it, and it isn't just about the police. A lot of it is about what happened in the Ferguson Municipal Court, what the judges did, and the insensitivity of the judges and the prosecutors towards these fines and fees. Certainly, there's public safety reasons to regulate automobiles, to have registration and insurance requirements. We don't doubt that at all. But how does this make it so unlivable that it creates health and safety concerns for the people who are unable to keep their car status registered? We can understand the police officer ticketing that more than I can understand the municipal judge and a system of law that doesn't account for these sorts of scenarios. I think the second takeaway of this is the question of whose safety matters. There's a question of what we mean by safety, but whose safety matters. And we do see this a lot. My experience as a criminal defense attorney, when I say that, people say, oh, there's terrible people, they do terrible things, and you represent them. There certainly are some people who cause great harm to others and pose a risk to others. But there's many people who in addition to that risk, there is the risk of their removal from their communities, the risk that they face if they're incarcerated, uh, with populations of people who are more dangerous than them or without safety for them when they're in those scenarios, and the risks that are posed if they're unemployable. Put on top of that, what we see today, central to our country's concerns around immigration and immigration enforcement, is the risk that even the lowest level misdemeanor, which the punishment is meant to be a fine of $200 or $300, no more. People don't even envision jail time, can trigger the mechanisms towards deportation or removal, even for folks who've got legal status in the US if they're not citizens. So these things all connect together, and my time is up, so I'll stop, but I'm looking forward to this discussion and hearing from my co-panelists.
We're actually running a little bit ahead, so we're going to come back to some of those points you made because I definitely do want to build on the particular part about the driver's license suspensions and the impact of that and the money attached to that. So I'm going to move to Alexius. And Alexius, tell us from your perspective, how do the anti-homelessness bills impact the safety and well-being of people experiencing homelessness and their communities? Are these policies unintentionally making communities less safe?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. As Leisa said, I'm Director of Research and Policy Development at the Coalition for the Homeless over in New York City. In this role, I lead the research team as part of our broader advocacy department. And just as some organizational context, the Coalition for the Homeless is the nation's oldest advocacy and direct service organization serving homeless individuals and families, and has had a historic role in establishing the legal right to shelter in New York City, which we'll be discussing a bit later. Further, all comments made are my own and not reflective of the coalition. Additionally, prior to this, I've worked in criminal justice and affordable housing roles, most notably at the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. So I'm fairly familiar with each side of the community safety equation, from both the government mandate to protect the public and to client advocacy within more nonprofit contexts. Regarding the anti-homelessness bills, I think it would be helpful to open with a brief overview of what's meant by this term. Anti-homelessness bills are laws or ordinances that criminalize or otherwise restrict behaviors that are unavoidable when people lack stable housing, rather than addressing the underlying causes of homelessness. So this would include bans on sleeping, sitting, or lying in public spaces, prohibitions on camping, tent use, or storing personal possessions in public, increased enforcement of quality of life offenses such as loitering, panhandling, subway sleeping in the New York City case, as well as laws that allow forced removals or sweeps of encampments without any kind of guaranteed placement into shelter or housing. These laws do not reduce homelessness, they simply serve to displace it. They have the function of shifting homelessness from being treated as the housing and public health issue that it is to a law enforcement issue, and imposes fines, arrests, and criminal records on people whose primary issue is fundamentally a lack of housing. Rather than improving underlying conditions, these kinds of enforcement first, or unfortunately, a lot of times enforcement only approaches, serve to deepen and further entrench the cycle of homelessness. So citations for the kinds of survival activities I mentioned earlier, sleeping, sitting, camping, lead to fines that people cannot pay. These fines can generate warrants, which in turn lead to arrests and incarceration. These arrest records, incarceration records create permanent barriers to housing and employment, with even brief jail stints being known to significantly increase recidivism. There is no empirical evidence that criminalization serves to reduce homelessness. Studies of the 100 largest US cities have found that these ordinances do not reduce the unsheltered population. So in other words, there is no deterrence factor to these policies. Instead, homeless criminalization laws, I believe, are a quick and easy means for policymakers to shift responsibility for systemic issues from themselves onto law enforcement. So while we might otherwise need a whole of government approach to addressing social problems, instead, we find ourselves tasking law enforcement officers with solving issues stemming from a lack of affordable housing, inadequate access to healthcare, or other issues. Law enforcement officers, those that I've known and I've spoken to on this issue in particular, are overtasked and overworked. They often feel overwhelmed with addressing every issue using the very limited enforcement tools available to them. And I think that this overall growth and preponderance of anti-homeless bills are largely symptomatic of limited political willpower and an accounting problem where we're willing to spend high amounts of money treating symptoms versus solving the problems. The only beneficiaries that these kinds of anti-homelessness bills, I believe, benefit are policymakers who would rather pass the buck onto law enforcement. Um, in terms of the latter part of your question, Leisa, as to whether these policies are making communities less safe, I think in in our thinking and discussion of public safety, we need to ask ourselves, whose safety are we considering? So in other words, we need a more holistic understanding of safety that includes people who are living unsheltered. So to touch on encampment clearing in particular, so the clearing away of often temporary shelters in public spaces. Encampment clearing typically leads to or the confiscation or destruction of property, in particular, identification, prescriptions for needed medications, and important legal documents such as birth certificates or immigration records. Multiple studies have found that encampment clearing events result in more deaths and significant disruptions in access to health services, especially mental health care and substance abuse treatment among those who have been impacted. There's also more secondary impacts where this kind of enforcement first approach to homelessness can suppress crime reporting for more serious offenses. So there's a real trade-off between the intensity of minor enforcement versus trust building needed for more important cases such as violent felony offenses. So people experiencing homelessness, especially unsheltered homelessness, are disproportionately likely to experience violence. 14 to 21% of unhoused people are estimated to have been victims of violence compared to 2% of the general population. And we need to be able to have a holistic understanding of safety that prioritizes the needs of our most vulnerable.
Alexis, thank you for that. There's a couple of things that I want to touch on that you mentioned, that homelessness, the anti-homelessness bills stem from lack of housing. We're talking about the determinants, social determinants of health. Stable housing is one of the social determinants of health. And just real quickly, for those who may not be familiar with all of the determinants of health: economic stability, education access, healthcare access, neighborhoods, safe neighborhoods, and social and community ties. Those things all are part of the discussion about public safety. Those are part of the things that make up safety. So I want to get to Matt. I know we're all waiting and ready to just continue this conversation, but I want to get to Matt and bring him into the conversation. And Matt, the term public safety, it's often defined as safety from other people. Alexia's kind of touched on that. But we know that what makes communities safe involves a lot more. When policymakers use or talk about the assumptions of public safety, what are some of the assumptions that are baked into that definition? And what do those assumptions miss about how people actually experience safety in their daily lives?
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm so happy to be on this panel today. So just by way of introduction, as Lisa said, I work at the Center for Effective Public Policy. I co-direct our Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research project, which focuses on decisions at the pretrial phase, particularly around release, detention, and conditions of release as somebody appears at their first hearing. But we also look at the entire system, the entire pretrial system, and look at things like citations, summonses, diversion options, et cetera, in an effort to enhance community safety and well-being. And this kind of the way I use that term, I think, builds on exactly your question, Lisa, which is, I come from a legal background. I'm a lawyer by training, and I think that when I entered this work, I had a pretty traditional understanding of what public safety meant, right? It means protection of one's like physical body against physical harm from others. But the more I've worked in this space, the more I've grown to learn that what makes a community safe and stable really goes much beyond that. And I use the term stable intentionally because I think safety isn't just about not being shot or not being physically harmed. It's about having a stability in your life. And this goes to Alexius's point about homelessness and to other things that people have said today about financial security as well. But you want to have a sort of sense of stability in your life and that your basic needs are going to be met, that you can take your kids to school, that you can feed them. And that is a broader sense of what safety means. And so in the context of the work that we do, really when we look at sort of the pretrial phase of the criminal legal process, I think everyone agrees, Eve spoke to this a little bit, like there are people who are dangerous, physically dangerous, and they may need to be in jail or in prison. But there are a lot of people who aren't posing that sort of risk or threat to the community. And so the question is, how do you most effectively deal with those folks, even if they have committed infractions that are, illegal, against the law? And what we have seen is that there are many ways to deal with those folks that are more effective than incarceration, right? More effective than just pure criminal legal system processing. And so one of the questions that at APPR we deal with is not just whether to release or whether to detain, but when you release someone, what are the voluntary conditions? What are the social services that you can connect them with that are going to address underlying needs and lead them to be more law-abiding in the future, but also just lead them to be more successful members of the community? So I think that's a big sort of public safety question that people don't typically think about. The other thing that I'll just build on from prior comments is that there's a huge amount of evidence now that if someone is unnecessarily incarcerated, that it actually increases the likelihood that they will be involved in the criminal legal system going forward. There are a bunch of reasons for that, right? Especially when we're talking about people on the margins who might have unstable employment, unstable housing, right? If you send them to jail for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, they're probably going to lose that job. They might lose that housing. They'll lose family ties. And that actually then undermines the safety of the community, the stability of the community. And again, that doesn't mean no one should go to jail, but it means we need to be really thoughtful about the criminal legal system responses that we're using and who we're using them on, and make sure that we're deploying those resources in the most effective way possible.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. I'd like to build on your last point about who we are keeping safe and some of the ways that the current practices undermine public safety. And at this point, I want to bring all of the panels into this discussion. When we're thinking about public safety and communities and the public, what are some of the other ways that you see stakeholders, elected officials, governments, local governments, what are some of the things that they can begin to do to address some of those underlying needs and to, as we say, reimagine and redefine what we consider public safety? I think the definition is kind of what drives the current model of public safety. But what if we redefined it? And how do you think that would help? And some alternative approaches to how we manage, for lack of a better word, people who are in the criminal legal system, whether that's through being unhoused, whether that's coming in through, say, citations or driver's license suspensions, or any other, some of the other ways that people enter the criminal legal system. Eve, you talked about misdemeanors. What are some of the things that stakeholders can begin to do to kind of start redefining this?
Can I
Whoever
just
wants to
make
go
one?
first.
Sorry, to make one suggestion, and this is more of a process point than a substantive point, but I think one of the things that we have found at APPR to be really foundationally important is bringing people who have been involved in the criminal legal system into these policymaking conversations, right? Because, I have not been involved in the criminal legal system, so who am I to say how best to meet the needs of somebody who is. And most people who are in policy making positions within the system also don't have that background experience. And so I think bringing people who have previously been involved in the criminal legal system to the table in really substantive policy making ways, not just as a sort of seat at the table and tokenizing, but to say, right, how did you experience the system? What would have been more helpful to you? I think that's a really important thing to do. I think that is a conversation that's happening more and more nationally, but it's relatively new, right? Like, how do you involve people in the policymaking discussion if they don't technically have like legal authority to make policy? But I do think that's that's where I would suggest that people start as a starting point to address these issues, is talk to people who've been through the system and know what their needs are and what would have been helpful.
I would actually agree. I'm so sorry, Eve. I'll just make this point really quickly, that I absolutely agree with you. And as an organization, we agree. FFJC is working to build out those community engagement programs and bring more people who are impacted, because who are we at the policymaking levels, or who are we at those levels to say what somebody who has been impacted actually needs? We must have those and bring those voices to the table. I think Sheriff Walsh touched on that before. I'll be quiet to even let you go ahead and make your comment, but I appreciate that point, Matt.
Yes, I just wanted to co-sign, but also expand on Matt's point. People who have been impacted because they were targeted for policing or prosecution, or they were convicted of a crime, but also their friends and family, their community. So what children didn't go on a field trip because the money for the field trip went to a court fine? What family is not able to, pay co-pays for medical care because every time they talk to their loved one in the prison, the bill is through the roof because the company that provides communication services for the prison charges so much per minute, and so forth. So we can go on about it, but these voices are also coming to the fore more, and I think we need to invite them in. I'm thinking of the Nevada organization Return Strong, where many people in there are directly impacted, both their own experience, but also a loved one, a spouse, a child who has been a defendant or has been incarcerated. So I think that's really essential to this process, and not just in the way that we have seen it sometimes in the past, where you get one person on a big committee who's an impacted person, but they don't actually find their way into the discussion during the committee meetings on the new legislation, because what they're talking about doesn't mesh with the culture of the committee and the culture of lawmaking and policy making. So there's just so much to do and to think about in this area, in addition to just saying, well, let's listen to the voices, let's invite, to really shift the way, and really shift the way that we do things, and how we listen.
And also, bringing in those voices should not be performative. We really need to not just bring them to the table, but actually give them voice and give them space, and take the recommendations and the stories that they bring and take them seriously and use them in our policymaking, and really use them to drive that policy and to create those policies. It is so important that we look at these things through a historical lens. I will say that also, and also just through the lens of the people who have experienced this, because who better to say what should be in place in somebody who has experienced that. And so I want to go back to something Eve said. I'm sorry, Matt, did you?
Oh, no, just to build on exactly your last point, and I'll
Sure.
be very brief here, but
Oh, we've got time.
one of the things that that you were saying is who better to weigh in on this system than someone who's been through it. I think one of the promising strategies that we've seen is having uh, someone like a peer navigator to help people. They go into the system and they have no idea what's going on. It is not explained to them in any understandable, comprehensible way. And so figuring out how you can connect people on the ground, people who are going through the system, with people who have been through the system, and we'll be able to say, here are the things that you can do, here are the strategies you can pursue. That can be whether they're in jail or out of jail on community supervision in some way, right? It functions in a bunch of different ways, but I think that in addition to this policy making discussion, I think this peer navigator role for formerly impacted or currently impacted people is a good strategy for jurisdictions to look into.
Thank you for that, Matt. I want to shift really quickly and just bring in a different way that folks kind of enter the criminal legal system. And I want to bring in Sheriff Walsh and all of you for this point. FFJC has worked on legislation, and we've seen across the country where law enforcement departments, rather than through policy, because sometimes the policy doesn't always get through those state legislatures, but we've seen law enforcement agencies through their policy make some traffic offenses, equipment violations, secondary offenses versus primary offenses, because we know that one of the ways people enter the criminal legal system is getting those citations for a broken tail light, or getting those citations for the license plate being in the wrong place, or having an expired vehicle registration. Sheriff Walsh, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. We have seen across the country where there are law enforcement agencies who are recognizing that this actually impacts public safety in a negative way when we're pulling people over for a simple equipment violation, giving them a citation. Now they have to go to court. They have to pay that citation. And to Eve's point earlier, they may not be able to pay that citation. Now they got to get a payment plan. There are fees that are associated with that. So we see where it begins this cycle of people being caught up in this criminal legal system, and it impacts and exacerbates poverty, and it further destabilizes those communities. Sheriff Walsh, if you could kind of speak to that, what could law enforcement do? What could agencies do to kind of help relieve that situation? Can we make some of those policies secondary? Is that a hard thing to do? And what should law enforcement, how could law enforcement implement some of those policies to be able to bring some relief to communities like through that?
Yeah, so I just want to go back to one thing that Alexia said, and because it's a thought that I don't want to forget. Alexis, you're really the first person I've ever heard acknowledge that especially with regard to homelessness, that the default is always law enforcement. And it kind of segues into what we're talking about here. And I'll give you an example. Locally, the Department of Motor Vehicles recently set up a reporting system through their website where you can report your neighbors or whoever you see a car on the road that's driving unregistered, report it to them. So, I don't know what the outcome of that's supposed to be, whether it's going to get referred to us or the jurisdiction in which this is observed. But again, the default is for law and order to be the answer of the day for these types of problems. And my perspective on that, that's clearly a revenue issue, because for those of us that live here, we know it's very expensive to register your car. So that's an issue. Is everything seems to default to the police officer on the street. And then the other issue, and I know Eve and I have talked about this in the past, is a lot of times these minor offenses are used in a pretextual way for us to further or continue when we suspect other criminal activity. So, which, there's always going to be the argument whether or not that should be legal or not. But, I think that's probably something that is part of the reason that we still continue to have this discussion, because it comes up when it's used in a pretextual way. But look, I think there's a responsible way to do this. I don't think that, it's something that we would necessarily, it would take a legislative change here in our state for that to take place. But I think there's a list of things and it's been proposed before and it has not passed, but we've taken some of the initiative on our own. There are certain offenses that we just simply don't enforce, even though they're on the books for enforcement. So I think there's a balance between, the community expectations, like I used the Department of Motor Vehicles example, but I think there's also, we're dealing, and I don't think any of these secondary offenses contribute to this, but we're dealing with a high number of traffic fatalities here once again from 2025. We had over 160 people killed on our roadways. So I think there's a conversation that has to be struck with that balance is, what are the things that are primary in the causes of those deaths? Because traffic enforcement should be done for the purposes of traffic safety, not for the administrative violations, my personal perspective on it. So, but we do use the administrative violations clearly to further criminal investigation. So I think we can survive what comes out of those criminal investigations and spend more time approaching what's actually causing people to die on our roadways from an enforcement perspective, and we'll be just fine. But it has to be meaningful conversation, and it requires a legislative change on our part. But in looking at the bill that did not pass, there's really nothing on that list that I found to be so shocking that we couldn't survive as a, we'd be just fine as cops if we didn't go out and enforce those as primary infractions. And I think it actually leads to a conversation too, is there a way for the primary infractions that are causing people to die on our roadways? Is there a way to expand the technology conversation in our own state so that we're focused on the things that are causing people to die on our roadway? Again, a conversation that stems around the central point of traffic enforcement for the purposes of traffic safety.
Sheriff Walsh, you bring up a good point. And a UNLV study that was commissioned for FFJC a few years ago pointed out that of all of the warrants that were on the books at the time, 80% of those were for administrative offenses, things like the broken tail light, things like expired vehicle registration, things like a license plate frame that's not in the right place. So we know that to your point, many times that's used for pretextual stops, but that's also the way that many people enter into the criminal legal system and get caught up in the system of fines and fees that lead to destabilization of families, communities, and that also takes officers off the street in many cases to enforce those warrants for something that does not increase public safety. In fact, it decreases public safety. And so how do we begin, again, to your point, to shift the conversation and the practices of law enforcement? How can law enforcement use their discretion to say, this is a broken taillight? Or should we be thinking about things like the Lights On program, where there are some agencies who have partnered with auto repair places? If they see someone that has, say, a broken tail light, rather than give them a citation that sends them to court, they give them a voucher to go to a particular repair shop to have that light replaced or repaired so that they don't get caught up in the criminal legal system through something like that. I'd love to hear the perspective of all of the panelists on that.
Before we move to everybody else, and I'll keep quiet. I think there was
Please don't keep quiet, Sheriff Walsh.
There was a perf meeting that happened in Nashville a couple months back, and they published a report, and there's evidence that even warnings actually have a better impact than actual citations. But I also think that, going back to the comments about, the paradigms that we operate within, and all of local government, not just law enforcement, but all of local government believes that the answer to our traffic fatality problem is to issue more citations. The challenge becomes in measuring what we're actually issuing. You might make an argument about certain offenses, but many writing a citation just to say we wrote a citation is not direction. We have to change that paradigm that exists, that a large quantity. We wrote about 40% more citations last year for traffic offenses, and our fatalities increased. So there's no evidence that more citations at all. I'm not basing it on 1 year. That's empirical over many years. There's really not a direct correlation between citations and reducing fatal accidents. That's the conversation needs to circle around how do you reduce accidents and how do you reduce fatal accidents? That's the key. If those citations that you're issuing are not the root causes of those things, then you're just spinning your wheels. You're just writing tickets for the purpose of writing tickets.
And another point about the citations and the number of citations that get issued, they come with fees and they come with fines. And many times those fees and fines are assessed on people in the system, but they're not collected. Courts and jurisdictions are not always collecting those fees. We have evidence and reports show that what's collected versus what's assessed is often just a small, minuscule percentage. And so in many cases, it's actually costing jurisdictions to try to collect those outstanding fees and fines through court rather than collecting them. It's costing them money rather than increasing revenue in some cases. So I'd love to bring some of the other panels. Alexius?
Well, on the topic of issuing fines, fees, and essentially creating more legal debt than a certain population could ever be able to repay. So thinking again specifically in the case of unsheltered homelessness, there's there's some really compelling research indicating that unsheltered people with legal debt experience nearly 2 additional years of homelessness compared to those without, even after controlling for history of incarceration, health indicators, demographics, everything. And on average, participants from that study, which was from Seattle in 2020, found that participants had an average of $12,000 in legal debt, with only 23% of whom were able to make any payments at all. So when we're thinking about the actual ability to collect, I mean, there's nothing as self-evident as I think the futility of imposing tremendous fines and fees onto people who cannot afford a home.
I would agree. I would agree. Another point that I would just like to share with the audience, going back to driver's license suspensions and people who've had their license suspended for non-payment of fines and fees will experience a loss of $12,700 in earnings each year that suspension continues. Can any of you speak to how you have seen the practice of suspending someone's license for unpaid fees impacting communities and families? Eve?
Yes, of course, this is so many of our clients who may come to us with other issues, and eventually we learn about their traffic trouble too. We've represented people who are charged with misdemeanors of, performing handyman work over $1,000, all sorts of low-level things. And eventually they come to us and they say, in addition to this, my license has been suspended. I'm still driving because I'm trying to get my kids to work, or I'm trying to get to a job or something like that. Because in a town like Las Vegas, you really need a car. It's very hard to use public transportation to get to work and get your kids to school and back and so forth. And to reinstate it is another fee. So this is, this level of regulation, and I would say registering your car, keeping your car insurance up to date, and keeping your license instated and active is such an expensive proposition on its own. And if it is something that is necessary, it is surprising to me that we don't have some form of assistance for this, similar to housing assistance, which I know is completely inadequate, as Alexius is making abundantly clear, and we know, right? But, some form of assistance for somebody who's, needs their car for these basic necessities of life. Of course, there'd have to be a process of proving it, but we have that in court sometimes. We have people appointed public defenders if it can be demonstrated that they don't have the finances, they don't have the money or the wealth to hire their own attorney and so forth. So it's surprising that we don't have that, but we don't. And once they get finished with their court fees and fines, they turn to the DMV and they learn that they owe another $500, $200, $500, whatever it is. And there's no representation there. There are no lawyers, there's no assistance, and it's even hard to figure out how to go about challenging something you think is incorrect within that system, to do an administrative appeal of a decision. So I think it can be completely devastating. And I think there are so many people here in that situation. And I just want to highlight what Under Sheriff Walsh said about the focus on that as opposed to the focus on truly reckless driving and making sure that those folks who are really posing a danger in their vehicles are, identified and they're stopped, and that risk is mitigated, suggests that the whole system is geared towards trying to collect money to support those agencies. We need a different way to support those agencies. You can't support these agencies relying on the poorest people in your community.
Sheriff Walsh, did you have something?
No, it's a great point, is that, what I think locally really requires more conversation is where do the fees and all that go. I mean, I know we're funded solely through, the property taxes and sales tax, and I don't know that directly the police department, is funded by that, but that is the problem with the funding, is that it's used to fund, it goes somewhere and they're spending it on something. So, and even I keep thinking about the conversation about, the homelessness too. It's, the comfort that elected officials seem to have with the idea that the place that, all the services that we talk about that are required to help people move on, the number one place to get those services is within the Clark County Detention Center. So that's just not a model, right? And so I think that the challenge that conversations like this will continue to have is people taking a responsible approach to actually looking at this and saying there's a better way to do it. And Eve's point is valid. There's no way they're collecting all the money that's associated with the actual fines that are levied on these things. It's just simply impossible. So, but when people are trying to get out of this cycle, there's got to be a better way to, leverage what's available for folks so that they're not stuck in this cycle. I mean, I always give the example to police officers. I said, just show people the image of somebody that's, been, we can't do this obviously, but, there's better ways to do things that besides put people in a continual cycle of poverty through citations.
Great. Great. Matt, Alexius, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I can't add much to that. I will just add the angle, since this is the issue I work on, around the assessment of bail or bond at the initial appearance hearing, and that there seems to be, I think, in the same way perhaps it happens in the fines and fees context, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between what is the purpose of imposing this fine, fee, or bond amount, and like what's actually happening. So are you intending to collect $1,000 from a person who's unhoused, right? Do you think that's going to happen, whether that's a fine or a fee, or it's a bond amount? Do you really think that person's going to be able to pay it? And I think what we always advocate for is more intentional decisions around these questions, right? It's just like, if Matt Alsdorf comes in and he doesn't have money, what are we going to do with the bond amount? Do we want to assess any at all? Is it because he's dangerous, or is it because we just usually put $1,000 bond on anybody who comes in with a Class C misdemeanor, right? So it's all about intentionality and really making sure, like the undersheriff said, like we're really thinking through, if we're assessing fines and fees, are we going to collect them? Or, as you said, Leisa, is it going to cost us more to try to collect them than we would even get in revenue? And so it's just really being more intentional and less just sort of like, this is a conveyor belt, this is what we do in this situation, and move on.
Right, right. And we know that if we're not extracting resources and wealth from communities, and leaving those resources in communities where people can support their families, they can get to the doctor, they can take their kids to school, that it's less likely that those folks will have to depend on social services costing governments more money. And so it behooves us, it behooves policymakers to reconsider the practices that we see and that we use, particularly funding government through fines and fees. We know that that practice is not sustainable. It is unreliable. If COVID showed us anything, it showed us that those forms of revenue generation are not reliable. And so it behooves us all to reform those practices and think about other ways to not only fund government, but also keep those resources in communities so that those communities can thrive and they're less likely to be dependent on social services when we do that. Alexis, did you have anything? I thought I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in terms of both what you were discussing in terms of resources for communities, as well as some of our earlier discussions around how we can engage the community in redefining public safety. I just wanted to share some quick takeaway from that earlier role at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, where while I was working there, I supported the Mayor's Action Plan for Neighborhood Safety, which, just gonna plug, was led by Renita Francois, who I believe to be a visionary leader. So this initiative essentially served to support participatory approaches to improving public safety outcomes in community-led initiatives in New York City public housing developments. And so this typically this is structured on a hybrid kind of social work and community organizing model. And key to that, and I think key to that prior discussion around community empowerment versus community performance or just community presence. This initiative hosted CompStat style meetings known as Neighborhood Stat, which featured commanding officers from the local NYPD precincts, as well as leaders and commissioners from other city departments. And so, similar to, and any law enforcement audience is likely familiar with this, but similar to CompStat style meetings, this would have leaders who were asked questions and held accountable by residents rather than sort of the top brass. So by residents from those public housing communities, and they would be asking about anywhere from local crime occurrences and police presence in the NYPD case to housing conditions and rodents and the like for leaders in other departments relating to housing, sanitation, what have you. And so that was a real way to kind of help shift and reframe that dynamic and kind of change the question around who's accountable to who, and oftentimes led to some of the first or I'd say about only interactions between top level leadership and the residents from the communities that they serve. Also, as part of this were participatory budgeting programs as part of this broader model where essentially residents could come up with their own and essentially get voted on to receive funding for their own non-law enforcement solutions to improving community safety. And so oftentimes this would result in projects in a model known as CPTED, or crime prevention through environmental design, where people from those communities are saying, hey, this area feels unsafe. I know that, because of those earlier neighborhood stat meetings, that there is crime that occurs on, by this entrance. And as a resident here, I can tell you that 1, there's no lights there. 2, the door is always broken. And 3, there's no one out and about. And so through these kinds of specific perspectives, they were able to identify the issues and think through, yes, those kinds of infrastructural fixes, but also thinking about ways to activate that part of the development so that there could be, community gardens, children's play areas, etc., more eyes on the ground, and generally more community cohesion within the development itself, so that you feel more comfortable and more familiar with your neighbor and feel comfortable engaging and asking for help when needed. And so I think that that's an interesting kind of flip on what law enforcement typically thinks of as it relates to broken windows or quality of life enforcement, where yes, the broken windows it could on the one sense be the sort of traditional framing that we think of heavily police every minor offense to prevent broader degradation. But I think that this flips in a way that we show that, like, yes, broken windows could literally mean fix the windows, improve the public spaces, invest in communities. And then finally, just wanted to touch on some research we did at the time, contracting with other research partners, where we engaged with residents from those public housing communities to ask how they define public safety. And lo and behold, people were almost exclusively talking about access to jobs, access to healthcare, green, healthy spaces, childcare, and then much later on, quite a bit further down the list, later on, police and police presence, never prisons. And so I think that those kinds of discussions, whether it's, the kind of neighborhood stat / ComStat model where we're finding that kind of direct engagement, as well as real substantive engagement with those residents in asking how they define public safety, is going to be critical to all this, because there really is a sort of feedback loop issue where only certain folks with more institutional access or power or the bullhorn are able to set those priorities, whereas when you actually speak to members of the communities that you're serving, you find that it's something entirely different.
Well, Alexis, I think that certainly speaks to the determinants of health as it relates to neighborhood and built environment and social and community context. We know that when people have healthy communities and healthy neighborhoods, they're more likely to thrive, and their families are. And that speaks to another point that I want to make really quickly, is that when we have these determinants of health strongly in place, we have increased secure and public safety. We don't have to target making crime go away, but preventing and strengthening the foundation that prevents crime from happening is very important. And Sheriff, I see that you come off mute. I'm going to give you a moment to make your point, but I just want to also mention that we're getting ready to get the audience, get your questions ready, because we're going to be moving to a Q&A shortly. And so we hope to get lots of questions, and I think we got some great panelists that can answer those for you. Sheriff?
So I wanted to just follow up on a couple of points that Alexius made, was that the neighborhood stat and the ComStat, those models, when implemented correctly, I know from experience that it's an accountability model, right? And I like the neighborhood stat, and we've done similar things here with regards to homelessness and a ComStat style meeting, because really what that does is the accountability gets shifted away from the police department, and it goes to the folks in the community that are supposed to be and are funded to do things about this. So that is, I totally agree with that. And I'm glad he mentioned the broken windows model too, because if there's anything that's been misconstrued in this conversation over the years and regarding law enforcement or any problem-solving model, is the broken windows and stop and frisk, and Alexi has touched on this. Broken windows and stop and frisk are two totally separate concepts, and they've been integrated over the years. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, Alexius, because it's a broken windows is about fixing the broken window and bringing all the community partners into the areas that are affected by disorder. And what we talk about with these things is, whether driving or homelessness, whatever, if it's disorderly things that are keeping people inside their home, that affects their basic health and human needs. And the only entity, it seems, in big cities to go out and solve these things that is continually held accountable is law enforcement. So I really do appreciate those comments, because I'll gladly partner with anybody that wants to help us solve these problems.
Thank you for that, Sheriff. Thank you. We're going to be moving into our Q&A shortly. Panelists, I want to just thank you so much for the discussion so far. And is there anything else that anyone wants to add to this particular part of the discussion before we move into a Q&A? We've got some questions from some audience members that we'd love to get answered. All right. Well, thank you so much again for this portion of the conversation. I see a question from Ms. Jennifer Evans. And so Jennifer says, we work in animal welfare field, and all of these fines and ordinances are similar to everything addressed here and often is additive to removing stability for people with pets. Most often, the municipalities help write the bills that they want policed and benefit from the fines. These ordinances often lead to animal abuse charges that are often only monitored in marginalized communities. We're currently fighting a bill in Philly that was called back the breeding that would impose $1,000 fine. Alexius, anybody want to speak to that? She says, what can we do to share at the hearing to help show this will not work and show the harm?
May I jump in here?
Absolutely.
So this is a great example of another area where you have a regulatory problem that's been turned into a criminal, a crime, a criminal problem, and also has fines and fees attached. Even if it weren't criminal, it can still have fines and fees that are too high for people. So it's a punishment model when the issue is probably not having enough money to take care of your pet, which is very expensive, right? So, or to provide the adequate space for it. Other areas like this are ordinances about weeds in the front yard or grass getting too high, and then you find out, lo and behold, the person who lives there is 90 years old and doesn't have the ability to take care of their yard anymore. They rack up the fines and fees and so forth. So in all these areas, I think they're perfect examples of where assistance is much more helpful, determining whether that's necessary, some form of assistance than punishment. But I really think that with local lawmaking bodies, there's always the push to generate more and more laws, that are more and more punitive as constituents come and say, well, my neighbor's house or my neighbor's dog and so forth. So you have to really show up with a real presence. You need to have people who have been impacted by it. And if they don't want to, you have to have people who are either peer support folks or their attorneys or folks from other organizations who tell the stories of what's happening to actual people and then provide, I think what's amazing about New York is it's such a laboratory for experiments in new ways of doing things, and it continues to be. So Alexius, some of these ideas about, are there other methods of addressing this problem, and really present that local lawmaking body with some alternatives.
Steve, I want to build on your point about the peer support because Alexius mentioned it earlier. And if I recall, there was a time when here in Las Vegas, we were thinking about with the adoption of Assembly Bill 116 that decriminalized minor traffic violations. It also kind of prevented people from having an attorney. You no longer had the right to an attorney in some cases. And so people were going to court by themselves and not necessarily knowing how to navigate these systems. How could jurisdictions or some of the organizations that are on the ground think about creating these peer support programs that help people, folks that have maybe gone through the system and are experiencing some of what others have experienced, and kind of help guide them through that system and help them know how to address a court or how to file a motion? How do we build on that? How do we make that more standard in communities?
Well, I'd like to mention participatory defense, which really grew up as community engagement, the friends and the families of people who were being prosecuted or were already incarcerated, to help the attorney or to push the attorney, sometimes that kind of help as well. But it has also turned into something where there's a wealth of knowledge among people about bail is a great example. Matt's work, how the family doesn't know how to pay bail. They don't know what to do. What are the options? And also, what do they provide to the attorney or the court to show that their loved one who's been arrested is stable and has stable work and will come back to court and not present a danger, which is what the judge will be thinking about. So I think you can have folks do this. There are laws in each state about practicing law without a license. And in the past, this has really stopped people from wanting to engage and give help. Certainly, it causes a problem in terms of, can you actually advocate for somebody in court if you're not a lawyer? Okay, but putting that aside, there's so many other ways, especially in the political forum, but also in these cases to start these sort of networks where if you have a group of people who have all dealt with fines and fees around traffic offenses, for example, you start a meeting where people who've been to the other side of that and made it through can say, try this form, try this, talk to this person, whatever resources are there, they can help each other. But I'll defer to anyone who's worked more directly with low-level offenses or fines and fees in these issues. Certainly the Fines and Fees Justice Center has,
You're right.
provides this advocacy more and more as well.
Someone asked in the chat, the Q&A, counties have become financially dependent on fines and fees. I think we spoke to some of that already. I think this is the most significant factor to overcome. Comments appreciate. Are there any quotas for police to issue tickets? Oof. Sheriff, I think that one might be for you.
No quotas. Quotas are, at least I speak for our jurisdiction. I don't know what they do other places, but it's one of those things too that comes up frequently because people believe that that's solely how police organizations are funded, or that there's some type of bonus system for citations, et cetera. So no, not here, not in Las Vegas. No quotas.
Well, I'll say this, we do see where jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, states also are so heavily dependent on fines and fees for revenue. And we firmly believe that government should not be funded on the backs of people who are least likely able to pay those fines and fees. Government should be funded from general fund. And so whatever that means for governments, but general fund, we believe is the way to go. Finding alternative funding mechanisms. But we just know that fines and fees are not the way to do it. It is an unreliable and proven to be an unstable form of revenue. So hopefully jurisdictions can begin to think of ways. And that, I think, engaging community, as we talked about earlier, bringing in those voices, engaging the community will help guide that conversation. But Sheriff, you have said before that sometimes law enforcement departments are about enforcement, and that's kind of what you're guided into doing. But thinking about alternative ways, as we are discussing here, and how do we implement those things, and what would that look like? Sometimes I think it's hard for people to do something different when you've done the same thing for so long. But pointing out that fines and fees that are assessed are not always collected, and letting jurisdictions know that it costs you money in many cases to collect these fines and these outstanding court debt and fines and fees, and that is actually harming public safety. And so pointing those things out, hopefully we can begin to really push governments and jurisdictions into thinking differently about fines and fees and revenue, and what are some of the other ways that revenue can be generated. I'll tell you, FFJC, we have some really powerful resources on our YouTube page. We have our budget analyst, Lillian Patil, who has done some webinars on revenue and budgeting that jurisdictions can go and look. And I think you'd be surprised and also delighted to know that there are other ways within budgets that you can look for and find revenue. It doesn't have to always come from fines and fees and assessing those fines and fees on the people who are least likely to pay them. So I also want to public safety practices, working or not in our communities. What's working, what's not working, what do we want to see change? What are some of the things that we want to keep? Anybody can take that. Are y'all saying that we've already done all of that?
Well, I'll weigh in. I believe that when we talk about all the things that we talked about here today too, especially two big things though, traffic safety and homelessness and enforcement on those issues, just to go back to an earlier point, it's not just how law enforcement responds to it, but it's how, society has been trained to deal with these things. And the first default is call 911 or call a non-emergency number and have the police respond. That's the default for everybody. And then we had an academy graduation a couple of weeks ago, and two of the kids that walked across the stage, and I call them kids, but they're 21 years old, and they now have a gun and a badge, and they're out enforcing the law, and they're going to go into homes. And, a 21-year-old is not equipped to solve problems that we have been unable to solve or address in a different way. And when they go to this scene or wherever it is that they're called to, and if it's a homeless person using private property or camping somewhere or doing something, their number one goal is to get there and solve the problem. And so what's at their fingertips is tools to solve the problem. And we talked about, citation, arrest, warning. It's the referral piece for all of these things, especially when it comes to homelessness. Where do they refer the person that's called and said, I'd like this person removed from my property, or I'd like you to address my neighbor who hasn't registered his car, or their tool bag has those four basic things in it: referral, arrest, citation, and warning, right? So beyond those things, if there's an expectation that's different for law enforcement, that's who's going to respond. And so I don't know, the referral piece has always been the part that's lacking. Police officers are problem solvers by nature. So I don't know that we know how much we contribute to the fines and fees part of this from an arrest perspective. And I don't think the community is aware either. And when I tell people it costs upwards of $300 a day for us to house somebody within the Clark County Detention Center, I'm frequently reminded that rehabilitation, detox, just basic healthcare in a hospital is relatively cheaper compared to what it costs to keep somebody in the jail. So I just think that from a paradigm, we're surrounded by this model that says call 911. And when you call 911, those are the four basic responses that you're going to get. I've simplified it to some degree, but that really is what's going to happen. There is no, hey, here's the number to call the homeless outreach team that's going to come here with a clinician and somebody that can get this person through the medical process to get into a rehabilitation facility so they can deal with their issues. That model doesn't exist. Law enforcement still, even when we can get somebody to those facilities, are still involved.
Yeah. And Sheriff, I love that you brought that up. And it reminds me of something when it comes to revenue generation and collecting fees and outstanding court debt with jurisdictions. One of the costs that is not always taken into consideration is that of officer salary. What does it cost an officer? What does it cost a city for an officer to stop someone, cite them, or arrest them if they have an outstanding warrant for, say, the broken tail light, and that has now turned into a warrant because they weren't able to pay the fees or the fines associated with that? What does it cost the city for an officer to stop someone, to arrest them, to transport them to jail, to tow their car? And that's taking an officer off the street for an offense that's not directly impacting public safety, not increasing public safety, and taking them off the street where they could be doing something that actually does increase public safety. And so that's another cost that jurisdictions don't always take into consideration. It costs money to enforce these fines and fees and to collect this debt. And when we point out that, as I said before, a small percentage, some cases 1 to 3%, is actually being collected. It is a counterproductive process and warrants us to evaluate whether these practices that we are engaging in are actually working, and what are all the ways that those practices impact our systems. We think that, well, I've got some fines and fees, they have to pay it or they're going to go to jail, but not always thinking about the broader context. What did that mean? And Eve, I think to your point earlier, how that impacts families. The person who's trying to pay these fines and fees now is taking money out. The kid's not going to be able to go on the field trip, or I'm not going to be able to pay the copay at the doctor. I'm not going to be able to put gas in the car to go to the grocery store. It just has a ripple effect. And I think when we're having this conversation about public safety, it's not just about keeping people safe from crime. It is about what are all of the things that make people feel safe and are safe so that we prevent crime from happening in the first place. Eve, you want to?
Yes, I'm going to go back to the connection between municipal funding and fines and fees. I think that Under Sheriff Walsh is absolutely right that this is not. Perhaps there are some rural jurisdictions with a local sheriff where they're funded really by the tickets from the people who go through town, but that's not like in big cities what we're seeing. But the municipal courts though there's comments made on the record and in the press about this court is going to pay for itself because, we do collect on fines and fees, that sort of thing. There's a due process problem when the fines and fees or the fees go directly to like a court slush fund. You can't do that because you can't have a judge up there saying, I got to collect these fines and fees because my job depends on it, right? Or the quality of my office furniture. If I want that, I've got to collect this. We have that case law saying that you can't do that. Okay, so the money goes to more of a general fund. And yet there is still this sentiment, this feeling that the fines and fees have to be collected in order to keep the system running and to keep the
Right.
people in the
Yeah.
courthouse there. Even though I'm not sure that's the case at all. If you didn't say, we abolished juvenile fees and there's still a juvenile court, right? So, it's this idea that like we have to do this is really in the minds of folks. So I just wanted to put that, I kept thinking about that. I know you asked another question after that, but I think the public safety that's involved in urban planning is something that is affordable and good for everyone. I'm thinking of an area of town where it's sort of between two other places where people like to go and have drinks or go for dinner and that sort of thing. But this particular area has low street lighting. Sidewalks aren't good. There's only one business there, and it attracts folks who sort of might be bother other folks who come around to that business and so forth. Instead of calling the police every day to arrest or to talk to the same people, what about wide sidewalks, nice lighting, planting trees, inviting some other businesses into the area so it isn't just a dead zone. You have lots of folks around walking and riding their bikes and so forth. So I think reimagining our public spaces is a big part of this for traffic. You can't say this in Las Vegas, but narrower roads and more lights, traffic lights, would change some of the fatality numbers, I think, because people just get going so fast. So anyway, I'm not going to just offer a whole array of suggestions, but to really work with the other folks. And those people exist in the planning departments of every city. And they're frustrated because they went to school to learn how to make things better, and nobody's giving them the money or the opportunity to do so.
Thank you for that, Eve. That's a really good point. We're almost at the end and we'll be wrapping up soon, but I want to just point to some of the resources that FFJC has available for folks that are on this call. You're going to get an email that outlines some of those resources that we've referenced today. But also we have a clearinghouse that has tons and tons of research on it. And pretty much a lot of the things that we've talked about today, you can find some of those resources on there. There are budget reports and things for city governments or local governments that are thinking about alternative ways of generating revenue. There are reports that talk about the money that is saved for states for not by eliminating driver's license suspensions and things of the like. We have so many resources available. So I encourage you all to visit our website, visit and check out our clearinghouse and see what's available to there. You might be surprised at some of the things you find. And again, just thank you for everybody for showing up. Before we go though, I have one last question that I want to ask all of the panelists before we close out. This is a conversation about reimagining. So imagination. If you could wave a magic wand, what would the world look like through the lens of a reimagined model of public safety that integrates the determinants of health as we have talked about today and focuses on public health? I'd like to hear from you. Eve, would you like to start?
Lawyers aren't the first one you go to for imagination.
I think Andy might say the same thing. So maybe I should have went to Alexis or Matt
I'll
first.
think about it a little bit.
I'll
All
go.
right.
I don't mind going first. Alexis, I don't know if you wanted to go first or not, but since Lisa was going to call on you, so look, I don't have anything imaginative other than to look at the past and think of something that Sir Robert Peel said in the 1800s. He said, "The true test of the police being efficient is the absence of crime and disorder, not the visible evidence of the police dealing with it." I don't know. I mean, I live in this imaginative world from time to time where police officers drive around and just wave and say hi, and everybody's happy to see them, and we feel like firemen from time to time, and we get applause, and just listen, the constant having to respond to what's going on in the world. I just wish we were in a place where there was some peace and some tranquility, and regardless of your zip code, you felt like you could come out of your own house with your children and your pets and enjoy life. So I just the absence of crime and disorder would be what that imagination would look like to me.
Thank you for that, Andy. Who wants to go next? Alexius, I'll call on you.
Absolutely. So and we had on this point earlier, but I'd say in an ideal world, uh people who are impacted by outcomes, people who are impacted by policies would be those who set the agenda. Um and set the agenda and identify the solutions. And because there is no kind of final end state to any progress, I think that in general we need to be experimental. We cannot keep trying these same approaches over and over again and somehow expect different results. We all live in the same kind of policy contexts where fines and fees and over enforcement or over punitive policies are the norm, and we've seen the outcomes that gets us. It's, crime has not been solved. Uh, in many cases, a lot of people are not better off. And so we need to think about what are the real ways that we can address people's needs and kind of what are the sorts of circuit breakers that we can do to address them. And then, since we're talking about an ideal world, I just want to truly emphasize this point that the only solution to homelessness is housing. That is it. There is no other solution. It's people think of this as a challenging problem, as homelessness is a challenging problem, but it's one of the only problems where the solution is in the name itself, and we need to get real about that.
We're certainly not going to enforce our way out of a problem of people being unhoused.
That's right.
Eve?
Yes, I think the piece about having impacted people as decision makers and creating the vision is essential. And then from my view in the courthouse, I would say that basically see people just, if they end up at court, because of an arrest or a citation, it's a brief moment where an issue is figured out and they're connected outside of the courthouse with the right services, not endless court dates, not problem-solving courts, but if they have mental health issues, those services are there. If they have housing issues, those services are there outside of the criminal system, in a world where we have those other systems and they're funded and they're understood as even more important to public safety.
Matt, finally, you?
It's hard to go last after this group because basically I just want to echo everything that has already been said. I mean, I think it is, yes, engaging legal system involved people in the process, and also this, let's not just focus on enforcement. Let's look at what are the affirmative steps that we can take as not just as criminal legal system agencies, but as a society, as like a social sector to create the foundations for the society we want to live in, which certainly includes as a pillar of that public safety. But as opposed to thinking about it from an enforcement, like after it's happened, uh, question, let's think about what we need to create in order to have that be a baseline sort of realistic expectation for all communities. So I don't have the magic wand, unfortunately, Lisa. I'm not sure who you sent it to, but I didn't get it. But if I did, that's sort of the way I would think about it.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. And on behalf of all of us here at FFJC, I thank each of you panelists for your time and your expertise today. And I thank each of the attendees who took your time out to join us and attend today's webinar. This is such an important and necessary discussion, from all the ways of the way current models of public safety show up in our daily lives to what a reimagined model that integrates community voices would look like and how it would impact the determinants of health, to keeping wealth and resources in communities through alternative enforcement models. I think we just must continue to have these discussions to bring in the ideas that support the creation of a world where people can live and thrive, raise healthy families, and contribute to their communities. So thank you. We had some great suggestions in the Q&A. And so I hope that we will, in our own circles and in our work and in our daily lives, our communities, just continue to have these discussions. So again, thank you all for the work that you are doing to create a world that we all can live in and thrive. May you all have a great day, and we will see you the next webinar. Peace.